The ultimate reality of war is that it's about people killing each other. We're familiar through films and television with some of the brutal images, but the truth is that fighting and killing is often done at close quarters, in confined spaces, and in sheer terror. Britain was last invaded in 1066, but she's been ready to repel invaders on a number of occasions since. This fort, on a ridge to the north of Portsmouth, is part of a defensive shield constructed in the 1860s, and it's about to take on a new role. For years, Fort Nelson, abandoned and overgrown, kept its secrets hidden beneath brambles and bracken. But now at last, it's being restored, and the extraordinary story of one of the last forts built in Britain can be put together for the first time. There are hundreds of forts in Britain, some dating back beyond Roman times. But why, if this fort was built to defend Portsmouth, is it so far from the sea, facing inland? To find the answers, we have to look at the way that artillery has developed over the centuries, and at the contribution made by this man, Sir William Armstrong. For centuries, smoothbore guns like this, loaded in the time-honoured way of ramming powder and ball down their barrels, formed the main coast defence of Portsmouth, Britain's premier naval dockyard. But in the 1850s, technology transformed this picture. Heavy, more accurate guns had a far greater range. So to defend a place like Portsmouth, it was necessary to build fortifications further away to keep an attacker out of range of the dockyard.
Light port fire!
In the centuries before the first aeroplanes, Britain's security depended on command of the sea. That, in turn, hinged on possession of bases like Portsmouth. In the 1850s, relations with France deteriorated when she produced new potent warships like La Gloire and developed the naval base of Cherbourg. The British response was to upgrade the forts guarding the western approaches to Portsmouth and to build 4 sea forts straddling the eastern approach. But France had a huge army, and it was feared that a sizable French force might land to the east and attack Portsmouth from the landward side. To prevent this, Portsdown Hill was fortified with a line of 6 forts, and the Gosport Peninsula was defended by another line of forts. The fire from these forts overlapped to provide a protective ring around Portsmouth. The forts were never attacked, and by the time they were completed, many people considered them already obsolete. So they became known as Palmerston's Follies, after the Prime Minister who built them. In 1978, the Ministry of Defence abandoned Fort Nelson. By this time, it was badly neglected and overgrown. The fort was bought by Hampshire County Council, which embarked on an extensive programme of restoration. As the undergrowth was stripped away, the fort's enormous potential became clear. First, as a fascinating place in its own right, but second, as home for the hundreds of historic artillery pieces in the care of the Royal Armouries, the National Museum of Arms and Armour in the Tower of London. When the restoration work is eventually complete, Fort Nelson, a classic example of artillery fortification, will be home to guns from the 15th century onwards, forming one of the best collections of artillery anywhere in the world. Artillery is not a new idea. The Romans had artillery like these ballistas, which used animal sinews under tension to propel their projectiles. Even a weapon this ancient makes the essential and simplistic point about artillery. It's the projectile that does the damage. The gun is just the system that projects it. Over the years, guns and projectiles have not necessarily developed at the same pace. What changed artillery forever was the invention of gunpowder. I'm down in the gloom of Fort Nelson's main magazine, where the gunpowder was stored. Gunpowder was made of sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal. We can't be certain who invented it, but we do know that cannon first appeared on the battlefields of Europe in the 1330s. For centuries, cannon used black powder like this. It burnt with a lot of white smoke and gave off a horrid sulphurous stink. Black powder was dangerous stuff. A single spark might blow up not only the magazine, but the rest of the fort as well. So there were elaborate precautions to guard against accident. The magazine staff wore felt slippers, and there were these special lanterns, hooded so that no spark could possibly escape. And the corridors were laid out so that the main body of the fort's garrison never needed to come near the magazine at all. As many as 2,400 barrels, each containing 100 pounds of gunpowder, could be stored in the vaults below Fort Nelson. Heavy shells and wooden barrels were hauled 40 feet to the surface by soldiers straining on the hoist. Cannon and fortifications have always been closely linked. In the Middle Ages, long before cannonballs, a strong castle such as Kenilworth, resolutely defended, could resist a siege for months. The advent of guns changed all that. Many early guns were cast in bronze, but although they were capable of firing heavy projectiles, many of them were so big that it was difficult to move them. Casting cannons was hard, hot, physical work. First, an impression of the cannon was made in a mold of loam, a mixture of clay and sand, containing a core to form a hollow cavity in the shape of the gun. Into this, the molten metal was poured. And as soon as the metal was cool enough to work, the mold was broken away, and the foundryman could see if his gun was sound. The earliest cast gun in the collection is this superb Turkish piece. In 1453, the Sultan Mohammed II was planning the siege of Constantinople, last outpost of the Byzantine Empire. He ordered his Hungarian gunmaker to build him the most powerful guns in the world. They were cast in two pieces so that they could be moved more easily. The Turks bombarded the city for 50 days, ripping great holes in walls and towers, and then they assaulted, killing the emperor and snuffing out the empire in the east. The heavy gun had made its dramatic debut on the stage of history. This particular piece was cast 11 years later and was used for the defense of the Dardanelles, the narrow straits leading up to Constantinople. Its stone balls may look primitive, but when the British Admiral Duckworth took his fleet into the Dardanelles in 1807, balls like this did ferocious damage to his warships. Given the technology available, it was difficult to cast guns heavy enough to stand the shock of repeated firing, but not so heavy that they became absolutely immobile. Gun founding became a craft, bordering almost on the occult. Cannon bore the insignia of the princes whose power they symbolized, and sometimes they had names and characters of their own. This revolutionary French piece bears the name of the great freethinker Voltaire. This elegant Renaissance bronze gun bears the initials of Henry II, King of France, and the bow of the goddess Diana, representing his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Further up, there's the intertwined D and H, topped with the royal arms of France.
Prepare the piece to load.
Please quiet. By the time of the English Civil War in the 1640s, guns like this Saker could fire a 6-pound ball to an effective range of 500 or 600 yards.
It's fun.
The problem was that it was difficult for horses to haul even medium-sized guns like this down muddy lanes, or for their crews to manhandle them into firing positions on the battlefield, though they were seen in such battles as Naseby, Edge Hill, and at the siege of Basing House near Basingstoke. In fact, 80% of guns in the 1660s were on ships, like this very rare gun of the Commonwealth period, which is part of the Fort Nelson collection. As artillery became more powerful, fortress makers started to build down, not up. Instead of high walls and towers, vulnerable to siege guns, they built low fortifications with earth slopes facing the attacker and supporting bastions and gun positions sited so that one part of the fort defended another with its fire. To take Fort Nelson, an attacker would have had to fight his way up the slope towards the fort, initially under fire from the heavy guns, and then he would come within range of the 13-inch mortars, which would rain explosive shells down on his siege works. If he managed to get to the edge of the ditch, he could either attempt to bridge it or fill it in by blowing up and collapsing the edges. His troops could then use ladders to scale the fort's wall and fight their way over the ramparts and up the tunnels to the barracks. If the defenders had any sense, they'd have surrendered by this time. Fortress design was heavily dependent on weaponry, and this is the gun that led to the construction of great forts like Nelson. It was designed by the Newcastle-born inventor William Armstrong, and his main contribution were these great bands of iron shrunk onto the barrel to reinforce it at its weakest points. This made the weapon able to handle heavier charges of powder than before and to push its shell out to new, long ranges. There were two other breaks with the past, both brought together in the Armstrong gun, although not Armstrong's invention. The first, the projectile is conical. It was fired down a rifle barrel and spun in flight, so it was far more accurate than the round cannonballs of yesteryear. It was also filled with explosive and fused at the nose and did ferocious damage when it burst. This is the second major change. The Armstrong gun is a breech loader. Powder and shot are inserted at the breech rather than rammed down the muzzle, and the detachment could operate it with far less muscle power than before. The gun's housed in a Haxo casemate, named, ironically, after a French military engineer, and it would have been incredibly difficult to knock out. The Armstrong gun, now at the fort, was restored in Cornwall, and then brought here to the Hampshire Museum Service's Winchester workshop, where a new carriage was made. No working example of the Armstrong gun was known to exist in Europe before this one was found in a car park in County Cork, Eire, where it was being used as a bollard. The museum undertakes the restoration of many artillery pieces and gun carriages. Graham Reimer is the keeper of weapons at the Royal Armouries.
How are you going to...
Well, the whole trail up to the box is going to have to be completely replaced. We've had some made up. We'll be keeping, obviously, the handles. The Imperial Wart is similar, but it's a lot worse in length.
Yes.
It'll have to be taken right back to as far as the elevation screw.
So you're going almost up to the breech, under the breech mechanism on the Imperial War Museum's gun, which is the same.
We're only going about halfway through the toolbox on this one.
But obviously the things like
The restoration at the fort has been helped enormously by the formation of the Palmerston Fort Society.
Palmerston Fort Society was formed in 1986. A group of interested people decided that they would like to restore, research and find out everything they could about the Palmerston forts. We were asked by Hampshire County Council to assist with Fort Nelson specifically, and they gave us room up here where we established our headquarters. We assisted them by clearing undergrowth and also doing a lot of research on the history of forts all over the country, not only just in the Portsmouth area, and we've produced several papers and reports about this.
In the 1880s, the fort would have been manned, month after month, by a force of perhaps 12 regulars and 170 local volunteers, men of Hampshire waiting for an invasion. In his song, even the arch-patriot Kipling recognized the reality of war as it affected the archetypal soldier, Tommy Atkins.
Well, I had sent to the streets again and to myself said I...
Well, for the volunteers, they had a wide variety of occupations. Initially in the 1860s, when the volunteer corps were formed, it was a very middle-class movement with shopkeepers, clerks, bank managers, all flocking to join the colours.
Well, it's like a Mr. Atkins when the band begins to play. So I went into a theatre as sober as could be. They give a drunk civilian room, but they hadn't none for me. They sent me to the gallery around the music halls. But when it comes to fighting, oh, they shove me in the stalls. It's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy wait outside. It's special train for Atkins when the troop ship's on the tide. When the troop ship's on the tide, me boys, the troop ship's on the tide. It's special train for Atkins when the troop ship's on the tide.
When volunteers held reviews, they were not always taken too seriously. Volunteers used to enjoy a drink, the same as anybody else.
For all the jollity in the mess, the volunteers knew that they might one day be fighting for their lives. They endlessly practiced their drills, and it wasn't only Armstrong guns that they were trained to use. This is another form of long-range defense. These 13-inch mortars fired heavy, explosive bombs at a high angle to drop down behind the besieger's siege works, doing frightful damage to his troops and equipment. In 1717, a mortar bomb fell in the main magazine of the Turkish fortress of Belgrade and caused an explosion, killing over 3,000 people. Hence the importance of making a fort's vital organs literally bomb-proof. But Fort Nelson was designed to cope with infantry assault as well as long-range bombardment. The deep ditch which surrounded it was defended by caponniers, gun positions impossible to see from the enemy side. These monsters are designed to sweep the ditch clear of enemy infantry. They're 32-pounders, once muzzle-loading, but later converted with a simple breech-loading mechanism. They fired what were, in effect, tin boxes filled with musket balls, firing like huge shotguns at a target they could scarcely miss. For many of the attackers, it would indeed have been the last ditch. If the ditch defences failed, the garrison could continue its resistance here on the ramparts, fighting from a series of loopholed walls, making the enemy pay for every inch of the ground. The last inner stronghold was the barracks itself, home of the fort's garrison. An enemy who reached the rear of the fort would find himself under withering fire from rifles behind those windows and from cannon placed on the roof to guard against just such an eventuality. During its restoration, the fort has become a research centre for the study of artillery. And researchers such as Ruth Brown come here to try to find out where, when, and by whom the various guns were made.
What happens is that this is a British government gun, bought probably for the Navy. And the government wanted to know where every single gun was actually made, because if it actually started to break up on use, they had to know where it was so they wouldn't buy a gun from that source again. So how they did this was to have marks on the trunnions here. And these marks were probably the signs of where the furnaces were. But there's no record of what any of those guns meant before the Napoleonic period. Now, it so happens in a series of correspondence that we've got that we can identify this gun when one of the captains in the Admiralty wrote back to the Board of Ordnance who'd supplied this gun to ask where it came from. And then they wrote back to the supplier. And they said it came from Conster Furnace, which is in Sussex. So it's actually made in the south of England. And this is important because it's the first pre-Napoleonic gun that we can definitely identify as coming from a particular furnace.
What's your next project?
Well, I'm actually off to Switzerland tomorrow to look at a collection of medieval guns. There's a very important collection that was left in Switzerland by the Duke of Burgundy. It was captured by the Swiss, and we know the exact dates on which the series of cannon, which is scattered right through Switzerland, were actually got, which is 1477. And that means that this is a datable collection. Now, by comparing that collection with the next datable collection, which is actually the guns off the Mary Rose, we can work out some kind of development in medieval artillery, just how they were made, how they were used, that sort of thing.
The collection here at Fort Nelson doesn't just end with Victorian items, but includes pieces from the two world wars. This is a Second World War German 88mm. It started life as an anti-aircraft gun, but it was later used with murderous efficiency as an anti-tank weapon. The Allies desperately needed an armoured, self-propelled gun during the Second World War, and the British and Canadians came up with the Sexton, which was built at the Montreal Locomotive Works. More than 2,000 were made in just 18 months, and they saw service at the D-Day landings and during the liberation of France. Now the Royal Armouries have bought one from the Portuguese army, and curator Nick Hall and researcher Angus Constantine are trying to get it back into its original wartime appearance.
Bits and pieces tacked on the outside.
Yes, I mean, I think that one looks as though it was taken, I think it's Salisbury Plain. In fact, the photograph was brought in by a local member of the Palmerston Thought Society who served on sextons in the war, but that post-war one, it really looks a posed shot, and all the stuff that we're interested in is apparently has been removed. Essential to run the vehicle. Most obvious perhaps the starting handle here, which apparently are very difficult to find nowadays, and that one was made up. Yeah, by Adrian Barrell, who also made another essential piece of equipment there, the track tightening spanner, because obviously you do get wear and slackness in the track.
By the time of the Second World War, these magazines were still in use, but now to keep anti-aircraft ammunition for the defence of Portsmouth. On the night of the 9th of January 1941, the fort was commended for supplying 1,200 rounds to the guns, even though there was a heavy air raid in progress at the time. Needless to say, the fort's own anti-aircraft guns were kept well outside its perimeter, so as not to invite an air attack. A single bomb landing in the magazines would have sent the whole hilltop sky high. Fort Nelson is developing as the National Museum of Artillery, housing a comprehensive collection of artillery from all over the world in a setting which is itself a memorial to the age of the gun. Mercifully, these slopes above Portsmouth never witnessed the same desperate scenes as the hills above the French city of Verdun. But in a sense, the forts were yesterday's deterrent, built at the cutting edge of Victorian technology, against a threat which seemed real enough at the time. Ironically, from the ramparts, we can see ferries leaving for the French port of Cherbourg, which caused all that trouble 150 years ago. But up here, in this beautifully preserved piece of Victorian military architecture, the Armstrong gun, the first truly modern artillery piece, has returned from a car park in County Cork to its home above Portsmouth, where it first sat to defend our island.
One round, case shot, low!